Welcome back to another video. I thought I'd do a quick comparison video between three of the cameras which I've looked at in the past, and two of these I've done reviews on recently. All A mount cameras, we have the Dynax 5D, also known as the Maxim 5D, A100 and the A200. All of these cameras have CCD sensors. I've done a few simple tests later on, but it's not too technical. This video will be more talking about the cameras and my own experience of using them. If you're looking for detailed information, I've done specific video reviews on each of these models. We'll start off with the body design and ergonomics, because this is quite an important part of cameras which is often overlooked. It's fair to say the 5D and A100 share a lot of features in terms of the layout. There's probably no doubt that the A100 was mostly finished before Sony took over from Konica Minolta. Perhaps the most obvious difference is the white balance control on the left-hand wheel with the 5D. With Sony, they decided to put a lot more functions on that dial, but that also meant that they dropped the ISO button and put that on there as well, and I think that was probably a mistake. Power on has the red on the 5D and it's green on the A100. Not something I lose sleep over, but it is something I did notice. Whilst the 5D eye cup is okay, it isn't that deep, and I found that the A100 did quite a bit better job on that, but the A200 has the deepest eye cup of all of these cameras. Although the back panel does stick out more on the A200, so perhaps it's needed. One of the most obvious differences that I noticed was the fact that the buttons on the 5D, they stick out quite a bit, and they're very easy to feel by touch. They're a bit flatter on the A100, but they have made them larger. With the A200, the buttons are almost flush with the body. They're much harder to feel by touch. And Sony, for some reason, they also added a bit of an angle on there as well, so it really makes pushing the buttons harder than it should be. There's quite a nice deep grip on the 5D, and there's also plenty of clearance there for your fingers. They don't feel cramped or pressured. They also added a groove there, so your fingers can go in there and hook under it, and it feels very secure. They did change the shape slightly on the A100, but the material is a harder plastic, whereas it's a rubber on the 5D. And you don't have that groove as well, so it's not quite as good in my opinion as the Minolta. The A200 grip is rubbery, but it doesn't have that groove in it like the 5D, and there is not that much clearance between the body and the grip. I also noticed that on the A200, the control dial at the front, that just doesn't stick up as much. It's smaller, so it just doesn't feel as easy to get to as the A100 and the 5D. 5D does have its weak points though. The control pad at the back, that does sort of flap around a bit, doesn't feel as firm. And the port covers do harden over time, so you'll see many of these missing. They certainly improved that on the A100. The D-pad is firmer, it just feels better using it. And all the port covers are plastic instead of rubber. A200 is perfectly okay. The D-pad probably feels the firmest out of all three of them. But the exterior finishing on the plastic does feel a bit cheap. It doesn't feel particularly pleasant to the touch. It has a sort of texturing to it. You'll often see shiny points or wear marks on A200 bodies. And the main exposure dial, that does feel a bit on the cheap side as well. It's much firmer on the 5D and on the A100. Not quite as good as the 5D, but it is pretty decent. Haven't talked about the flash too much on these cameras, but I will briefly cover it. In terms of the overall performance, all three cameras are kind of mixed really, to be honest. The A200 is probably the best overall, although it does have the obvious problem that the flash doesn't extend up very far, so red eye is definitely a problem with the built-in flash on the A200. I did do a quick list out so you can have a look at that, just to cover some of the areas which I have found myself. There is a bug with the 5D that overexposes with bounce flash at wide angle. A100 is also a bit inconsistent with its flash. There is an issue with lazy eye flash. That is something which is common to the earlier cameras. Easy workaround for that is if you are doing any flash work, pick up a Metz AF1 or 2 flash. The reason for that is it has an A mode, and that has a special sensor built onto the front of the flash. So you can completely bypass TTL on the camera, and there is no pre-flash in that mode. And don't forget you have settings for the ADI and TTL, which do make a difference to the exposure as well. Although a lot of this is subjective in terms of the handling, ergonomics and design, I think overall that the 5D is the winner here. mostly because of the grip, and I think it is definitely one of the better grips I've used on any camera, even today. But there are some advantages with the other two. The A100 does have more functionality on that left-hand dial, and it does have a better quality D-pad. Grip is still decent on the A200, but the main advantage is that deep eye cup. May not be a problem, but it definitely does feel cheaper compared to the other two cameras. Let's quickly mention the compact flash slot. The 5D has a mechanism where you have to press twice, once to lift it up and then again to push it down to take the card out. A100 actually has quite a good mechanism. It has the button at the bottom, and it's just a single press on that. You don't have to sort of push it and then push it again, and it's quite a large button. There's a sort of safety feature with the A200. There's an additional mechanism there, so it stops you putting the card into the camera unless it is put in correctly. You can't put it in, for example, sideways by accident and damage the pins. Briefly talk about the LCD now. This is an area where the 5D is obviously going to lose quite badly. Really, it sort of falls into the barely usable category, but it does have a decent level of brightness adjustment. Viewing angles are also quite poor, so you have to be pretty careful when you are reviewing images. Definitely make sure that you do check the histogram. It's just about adequate for checking focus, but again, it doesn't look very nice even compared to modern basic LCDs. A100 is significantly better in terms of the resolution. It's a much nicer LCD, but it is quite dim. For some strange reason, you don't have as much adjustment on that. With the A200, this one wins easily. It's a much better LCD. It's slightly bigger than the A100, but it is much better in terms of the contrast. It's not surprising as it came out later on. This is one area that we saw quite significant improvements with cameras over the years. But I do give credit to Konica Minolta for making the only one out of the three that has an anti-reflective coating. There are quite a few features that Sony took out of the A200 compared to the A100 and the 5D. And some of these are very simple. It's purely just firmware based, such as being able to map the spot metering to the AEL button. And it has no shutter lock setting for the card, which is a really odd omission, as almost all cameras have this feature. And if you're using unchipped lenses or a telescope, you have to go into manual mode. There are some improvements. They did add an RGB histogram that's just luminance on the other two, and you have the info lithium percentage display for the battery level. I've done a list of the improvements. I don't think I've missed anything, but have a listen to the autofocus speed now. A200 definitely is faster than the other two. They did make some improvements to the focus speed, and that is noticeable in the real world too, particularly with the tracking focus. Some of these features might not make a difference to you, but it's worth knowing what you're getting. I'm showing you the A200 viewfinder. They're all the same magnification and layout. You just get the additional widescreen markings. And they also added some drive information such as the bracketing. That isn't present on the A100 or 5D, but they are exactly the same in terms of the magnification. Wanted to do some quick tests in terms of the image quality. It's nothing too heavy here. It's just really looking at what's happening with the cameras. And the first thing I noticed is there is quite a significant exposure variation between all three. Particularly with the 5D, all of these cameras are set up exactly the same and they are using the same lens and exposure, and the 5D has a lot more exposure compared to the A100 and the A200 at low and at high ISO. And it's not a small difference, it's around about 2/3 of a stop, with the A100 about 1/3 of a stop more sensitive than the 200 at the higher ISO settings. It does make an obvious difference to the low light performance, even downsampling the 10 megapixel images to 6 megapixels. You can definitely see that the A100 is struggling quite a bit in terms of the noise, even in RAW. A200 does a somewhat better job, particularly in the shadow regions. But when I added 2/3 of a stop extra for the exposure on the A200, it still didn't quite match the 5D. With the JPEG output, for some reason the 5D did the best auto-white balance, and also the JPEGs were significantly better at the high ISO settings. Taking it to 3200 on the 5D and A200, the 5D again is notably ahead of the Sony. Just a quick demonstration just to show you the difference between the 6 and 10 megapixel outputs. You'll be able to see that jumping from 6 to 10 megapixel, particularly with the A100, has an obvious effect in terms of the details. If I start zooming in, pixel peeping to 200%, you'll see the difference is more obvious. A100 consistently did better than the A200 in terms of the details, and I think that's due to the fact that it has a lighter AA filter. Honestly, don't notice any obvious difference in terms of dynamic range. It's very small, perhaps a slight advantage to the A200, but the A100 and the 5D have the high 200 zone matching mode, which I've covered in more detail in the reviews, and that can significantly help in terms of dynamic range, particularly with RAW shooting. They've all got decent battery life, but the newer Sony ones are somewhat better than the 5D. My overall summary with the cameras:
there's three salty looking dudes.
Largely going to depend on what you're doing. If you're someone that's doing landscape shooting, for example, you might prefer to use the A100. It does have the best details out of all three of the cameras, and that might be something which you find useful for that type of photography. It will also work pretty well for other areas such as macro. I think some of the design changes that are made improved on the 5D, but I think the main drawback with the A100 is the weak low light performance. The A200 is somewhat better in that regard, but it does have quite a few features that have been torn out, and some of them are quite annoying, particularly the mirror lockup. There was no really good reason for Sony to take that out. There are quite a few of them around on the used market, so they're easy enough to pick up. Having owned all three of the cameras and used them quite extensively, I really decided that the 5D probably was the best all-rounder for me. Although it's lower megapixels, the low light performance is notably better than the other two. It certainly has some of its own drawbacks, but I always found the images out of the camera were probably the most interesting out of all of the three that I'm looking at. A lot of this is down to opinion as well. For example, if you had the A100 and that was your first SLR or your first real camera, then obviously you've got an emotional attachment to that, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is photography, so if you like using the equipment that you have, nostalgia, things like that, they do matter. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. If you've got any opinions, do drop them down below in the comments section. Thank you for watching the video. It is appreciated, and I hope to see you in the next one.